Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Snowden. Recently, I appeared on the Religion Wise podcast with Dr. Chip Gruen, the director of the Institute for Religious and Cultural Understanding at Muhlenberg College. I had a blast talking about my teaching there with Dr. Gruen, who also appeared on this podcast recently to discuss his research on the catacombs of Rome. But before I ever connected with Dr. Gruen, I connected with Dr. Carrie Duncan, former professor of religious studies at the University of Missouri, former programs specialist at the Institute for Religious and Cultural Understanding at Muhlenberg, and current program director at Lehigh University. Dr. Duncan and I have been friends now for several years, ever since we connected for episode 59 of this podcast, where we discussed the historical Jesus and archaeology work in the Middle East. I was delighted to be interviewed for Muhlenberg's Religion Wise podcast when Dr. Duncan was affiliated with the Institute, but after our interview was recorded, she took a new position with Lehigh. I redid my appearance at Religion Wise with Dr. Gruen, and I'm grateful to the Institute for providing me with the original audio to highlight this wonderful conversation I had being interviewed about my teaching with my dear friend, Dr. Carrie Duncan. This one is all about teaching about religion in the U.S., both in person and online. So this one is for all my friends in teaching. I hope you enjoy it.
I'm Carrie Duncan, your host for this episode. Today, my guest is Greg Snowden, educator, teacher, and professional podcast host. Greg Snowden, thank you so much for joining us on Religion Wise.
It is a delight to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
When we met, you were teaching high school at the local public district in Columbia, Missouri, and you were teaching religious studies, the academic study of religion. This fact always surprised me. Religion was not on the curriculum back in the day in my public high school. And Missouri isn't a place I would have imagined would embrace the idea of religion as a subject of scrutiny. How did you get started teaching religion in high school, in public high school?
So it was a very big surprise to me as well. I was teaching 10th grade English at a high school in Columbia, Missouri, in Columbia Public Schools. And I had the opportunity because there was an enrollment in the school where a lot of students had signed up for a class in the catalog called Classical Ideas and World Religions. And I didn't know anything about this class. I didn't know that it existed. And my principal came to me and said, Greg, are you interested in teaching a class about religion? We're interested in having you teach it because you have a social studies and an English credential as an educator, and we can offer it as either one to the students. It can be English for the students, or it can be social studies. And I immediately said yes. I just knew that it was something that I had to do. And it was just a fluke occurrence based on this course that was existing in the district catalog, and that enough students had signed up to have the class, quote unquote, make, which is a term for when a class actually has enough enrollment to run. And I was just kind of in the right place at the right time. Does that make sense?
It does. What was so exciting or appealing about that offer?
So I immediately was struck by my time at Mizzou as an undergrad because I took several religious studies courses as an undergraduate at the University of Missouri, and I was never bored in those classes. Those classes inspired something in me to think deeply about the world in a new way. And it started having me realize that religion was around me, even if I wasn't participating in it. And that was an extremely inspiring thing for me to feel, because it just made me want to understand what people's lives were like, for people who were doing things differently than the way that I was doing them. So it immediately drew me back to being younger, being an undergraduate in college, and having these courses that inspired me to think about ideas and philosophies that I wasn't raised thinking about. And it was one of those right time, right place experiences for me, and it hooked me immediately. And then I was introduced to the teacher who had been teaching the class at Hickman High School down the road in Columbia, Missouri, named George Frizzell. And I met with George to talk about the class. And he immediately became like almost like a father figure to me, a mentor who brought me into this world of teaching about religion with high school students, and he illuminated it for me immediately, and I was immensely captivated from day one of meeting with George. He inspired something in me that made me rethink teaching entirely, and I was hooked from there.
How did students respond in the classroom, both to looking at their own religious traditions through a critical lens and to learning about traditions with which they were previously unfamiliar?
So this was something that really impressed me because a lot of students in the class, obviously throughout the years, were very reluctant to share their personal views on how they felt about their religious practices in general, but some were extremely outspoken. I'm thinking of a couple of students who on day one of the school year, one declared his fervent atheism and one declared her fervent, evangelical beliefs. And it was a really fascinating experience because these two students were sitting right across from each other in the classroom, and they kind of locked eyes throughout class. And it was like this thing like, oh my gosh, are they like going to be enemies for the whole year? But then what was so funny is at the very end of the year, those students collaborated on a final project together because they realized that it was 100% fine to coexist in the world. And so I was very impressed with the students throughout the years. They chose the class, so it was an elective that students chose to take, but every desk was full. Every year that I taught the class, it was 100% full. And the students who chose to be there had heard that it was a safe place to think about and talk about ideas and engage with a wide variety of people who would come and visit our class throughout the year. And it was just a place to think out loud safely and respectfully. And that is one of the most amazing experiences that I've ever had, that you can take something like religion, and when you do it in a respectful manner in a classroom, just how high students can rise to the occasion. I was blown away by them continuously, year after year after year, that they were able to have such high level dialogue and engage with such a wide variety of guests who would come and see our classroom and walk away from it feeling like they were a little bit more ready to be citizens in a world that is so diverse and so universally um, undiscoverable, almost like they were starting to realize just how vast the world's discoveries that they had yet to make actually are. And it was really inspiring to me to watch them learn in real time like that. Yeah.
I'd love to hear a few more stories from the trenches, as it were, about what went on in the classroom, things that were funny or profound or magical that you witnessed.
So, my favorite element of the class was the days that I would have guest speakers come to the class. And having guest speakers from the community come and visit a religious studies high school classroom can be sort of a nerve wracking experience for a teacher. But over the years, I made so many friendships and relationships with the various religious communities of Columbia, Missouri. And I developed this sort of network of guest speakers. So, what we would do is we would study a religion or a practice or a tradition for probably 3 or 4 classes. And all students had access to a Google document that was live during class. And they would ask me a question. And one of the things that I sought to do regularly is if I didn't know the answer to a question, I wouldn't pretend that I knew it, which is one of the things that teachers tend to do is they want to be the expert. So they often get things wrong and teach things incorrectly, which I think is something that's becoming more, where teaching is working it out of its system. But when I was a kid, teachers were answering questions, all kinds of stuff that looking back on, I'm like, was that actually correct? I feel like they didn't get it right. So students would ask me questions in the religion class, and I would say, I have no idea. Add that to our Google document for our guests that are coming later in this unit. And over the course of 3 or 4 or 5 classes, that Google document would sometimes grow to over 100 questions.
Wow.
And what I would do is I would go through the questions and I would delete ones that were repetitive, and I would categorize them and move them around so that there were things like practices, personal beliefs, questions about text, questions about holy sites, things like that. I would categorize them. And then I would send the list of questions to the guest speaker in advance. I would print out a class set of all the questions and arrange the room in sort of like a theater style seating. And I would put the questions printed out on every desk. And I would say to the guest, come in and introduce yourself for 2 to 5 minutes. And then I'm going to turn it over to the students and they're going to interview you from this list of questions. And it sounds wild to me just how much trust I placed in the students to run the class. But what was so amazing about that is that the students had done all of the preparation work. The guest didn't have to, labor over a PowerPoint presentation. All they had to do was walk in the room, say, "Hi, my name is so-and-so, and here's what I do." And then the students were like, hands in the air. And they would just interview that person for 70 straight minutes until the end of class. And I did that 25 times per school year with everybody from Orthodox rabbis to ordained Zen priests to local Hindus and Sikhs and Jains, a wide variety of Christian clergy from the most liberal to the most conservative. And it was just this series of events that students would engage for real in genuine and authentic conversation with people who practiced the religions of the world in their own town. And it was a connection that they got to make, and they got to engage as deeply as they were willing to go. And a lot of my students went into journalism majors and they were like, I just wanted to become a journalist because I loved interviewing people in your classroom so much. And I felt like a professional when you would have guest speakers. And that is one of the greatest compliments that I ever got as a teacher, is that students realize just how valuable it is to ask people questions. And they realized how important questions were to helping them feel like a more fulfilled person. And they felt comfortable in building these relationships. And that is one of my favorite stories to tell, because it just shows like what students today are capable of if we like step back and let them inquire about things that make them the most passionate to learn about. Yeah.
Did you ever face any pushback from students or parents or colleagues or administrators in doing this kind of work?
So I would sort of kind of joking, but not joking, at the very beginning of a school year, I would say things like, oh, maybe this is the year that I get fired because something goes really, really wrong in my classroom and I make the news and I have to resign. That is something that is a reality that I lived with the entire time I was teaching this class in a public school, is the fact that maybe this is the last time this ever happens. And so I would openly joke about it with the students, and they were like, they kind of thought it was hilarious, but I was like, no, seriously, like it really could happen. And then I would show them examples of teachers who had done something, made a mistake, said a misstated comment, or done a not totally thought out activity, and it went wrong. And that teacher would be on the news, and then the parents would be at board meetings asking for that teacher's resignation. So I was informing myself the whole time about these stories that happen around the country. So I was prepared for that to happen to me. I was not shy about that. And the parents were a little skeptical for sure. And I was openly inviting of them to come to the class anytime there was a guest in the room. So I would send out emails to the families and say, oh, so-and-so, like the Rinzai Zen priest is coming to talk in our class and is going to answer the questions from the students about Zen practice. If you are available between these times on this day, you're welcome to come. I'll have 10 extra chairs in the back of the class. All you got to do is email me and let me know you're coming, and I will send a student down to pick you up from the office and bring you up to the room. So I was very transparent with parents about what I was doing in the room.
How
And
often did they take you up on that? Like, how often were those 10 chairs occupied?
I think that like most of the time they were empty, but I think about because I had so many guest speakers, it was overwhelming. But I always made the invitation, and the parents. I think that I probably had about 5 or 10 times a year, parents would take me up on it. And it would just be like, oh, hey, I want to learn about Jainism. Can I come in? And I'm like, absolutely. So a lot of times there would be like 10 empty chairs, but sometimes there'd be 9 empty chairs or 8 empty chairs or 7 empty chairs. I think the most parents I ever had in one thing was 8, and that was for a Tibetan Buddhist monk who trained with the Dalai Lama in India. So it was a very, very high profile guest. And I was just very transparent about inviting them as often as they wanted to come. And there were 2 moms in particular who one year came about 10 times, and they always came together, both moms, and they were just so engaged. And they were like, I feel like I'm having the experience of a lifetime right now, hearing these conversations and being able to participate. So I was able to soothe the concerns of the parents by being very transparent. And a lot of them were worried that I was going to be, having a religious agenda myself. And that was something that I openly addressed on like back to school nights and things like that. And so that's there. That concern is there. And I was just as transparent about it as I could. And I was saying, like, I want you to come and visit the class because it would be amazing to have you. And I think that the parents felt very invited and included in the course itself.
What in the class did you feel like was most challenging for your students? Does anything sort of stick out in your memory of just something that really they needed to sort of dig down deep to deal with or to grapple with because I don't know, maybe it went against their preconceptions or it was a big ask for them? What did they find really challenging?
Yeah. So many things were challenging about the class. I would make students read Genesis and Exodus front to back, which was extraordinarily difficult. And I would make students read the entirety of the Bhagavad Gita and the Tao Te Ching and the Gospel of Mark, huge portions of the Quran. So there was a tremendous amount of being asked to consume texts that were tremendously challenging, written in not an easy to digest type of way. But I would say that one example really jumps out. So I had a lot of students who were going into the military, for example, after high school. And there was the times when I would have them read the Bhagavad Gita, which is about war and the reality of death in war is one of the topics that gets discussed. And I had students realize that they might be asked to or forced to kill somebody within their life. And we're sitting in a very cushy and comfy classroom in an $80 million high school in Missouri. And they're having these epiphanies about what their life story may yet include. And those are some memories that really linger with me when students look at some of the moral and ethical struggles that are described in some religious texts and seeing how the path that they are going to travel in life may include some of those struggles. So that was a really hard thing for me whenever students would have sort of like a personal epiphany that was emotionally challenging, and have to rethink possibly their own life paths as well. And there was also sometimes where a guest speaker would say something or tell a story about life, and it would lead the students to having some type of very emotional experience. Like, I think that there was one time a guest speaker came in, and the topic turned to death and the afterlife and the beliefs around the afterlife. And one student really became like visibly rattled because they had recently had a death and in their family. And there was a comment made by the guest speaker who said that, well, in my practice, like, we don't believe in an afterlife. When the lights go out, when the eyes close for the last time, that consciousness ceases to exist. And that student sort of had, you know, a sort of like kind of like an emotional breakdown in that moment. So there's a deeply emotional aspect to teaching about religion that you never know how it's going to connect with students. And so there was a lot of personal epiphanies that happened in the classroom based on certain moments. And those were things that I was really not prepared for. I was like, oh yeah, we're going to study religion like literature. And we did, but oftentimes literature can lead to deeply emotional truths and deeply emotional realizations about oneself and one's life. And we had a lot of those. So there was a lot of really difficult moments in the classroom where I was struggling to connect with a student who was undergoing some type of, very personal experience that I wasn't feeling, but that I had sort of caused. So it made me kind of feel bad sometimes that I had led the student to experience some type of distress. But in the end, they are always like, wow, that was some day we just had. And that kind of made me feel better. But it gets pretty intense when you teach about these things.
I'm sure. So at the end of the day, what benefit or what importance do you think there is in having this kind of class available to students at the secondary level, not having them wait for college? I can picture a lot of people thinking, high school should be for, learning science and STEM and how to
Right.
write a paragraph, and they can wait for college to have these sort of floofy philosophical idea-based courses. What do you think is important about not waiting, but starting earlier?
Oh, it's tremendously important. In my view, it couldn't be more important because being an adult in the world is to have relationships with many different people. And in order to have relationships with many different people, you have to learn how to ask questions to learn about other people. One of my favorite lessons that I would always teach to students is the importance of life story and being able to inquire with another person whose life has been totally different than yours about their life story. That's where human relationship flourishes. When a student has the ability to have deep conversations with people whose lives were nothing like their own, that is where you truly understand the depth of what it means to be a human being. And because you can see what life is like for people all over the world, and you really begin to internalize just how diverse the range of life stories in the world actually is. And so in high school, students are as curious as any age of people I have ever met. And people who say things like kids don't care, blah, 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 bore me so much because I have met thousands of teenagers and they all are so curious and thoughtful and they love so many things and they have so many questions. And that is like why I think this is so important, because if you can teach a young person how to ask questions of people whose life stories differ from them, you have set them down a path of being a learner forever. They will have the skills to learn forever if you teach them how to ask questions about things they don't know and realize that not knowing the answer to a question is an endearing personality characteristic. I don't know so many things, and I'm about to be 38, and there are so many things I don't know. And I often make the joke that when I get my terminal health diagnosis someday, that's going to be the day that I start learning Japanese, because that is why I'm here. And that is what I seek to model to young people. And if there are adults in the world that model that to young people, like I'm 35, I don't know much at all, but I'm still learning. Like if we can model that we're works in progress too, that is what I think that students love. And as far as why it's important to teach about religion, specifically at those young ages, it's because of bridge building and relationships with people around the world. And just because it's in my view, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful topic to talk about because you can turn on a Google News alert for any religion that you can think of, and you're going to get news stories about it weekly. And so teaching students that it's also current and that it's beautiful and that it's about relationship building, I mean, what could be more important than that?
Well, speaking of being a lifelong learner and asking questions, in 2017, you created the Classical Ideas podcast, which has the following as its manifesto or mission statement, at least in part. I'm going to read part of the mission statement, which is, and I quote, simply stated, religion matters. Religion matters not only for personal reasons, but also for social, economic, political, and military purposes. Unfortunately, studies suggest that religious knowledge and cultural literacy for any religious tradition is either in decline or is non existent in the United States, despite being one of the most religiously diverse nations on earth. The goal of the Classical Ideas podcast is to empower students with the core knowledge of major world religions to improve citizenship and agency in a diverse society. End quote. You have, at this point, interviewed more than 200 scholars of religion about their research. What inspired you to start podcasting, and podcasting about religion in particular?
So when you read that to me, there were several things that I feel like I want to edit about my own mission statement now, especially the term major world religions. Like I think that's kind of like a term I want to revise in the future. But yeah, the Classical Ideas podcast, holy smokes, what a journey this has been for me. I started it because it was my students' idea. So during those guest speaker series that I talked about earlier, the students would come up to me at the end of it and be like, wow, that was so amazing. I wish we had a recording of that conversation with that person. So I was like, oh, wow, I wonder if I can record these. So I went to my principal and I said, am I allowed to record the guest speakers and do some kind of like class project release with it? And they were like, well, you need releases and legal forms, because if a student who is under 18 is on a recording and there's not a permission or a release for that type of information, then it could be problematic for us. So I was like, okay, let's rethink this. So I said to my students, this is what I asked the administration. This is what they said. And they were like, what if you interview the guest speakers that we meet in class, and then you can send the recording of your interview to our parents on the day that we have the guest speaker? So you can say to the parents, this is who your student is meeting today. Here is my conversation with them. And then the parent will listen to the podcast. The students would meet the person in the room. They would talk about what they learned over dinner. they would email me a little summary of what they talked about, and I would give the student extra credit in class. So I made a rewards system for the student to talk to their own parent about things that they were learning in their religions class. And I found that to be so amazing. These students were finding this like dinner table topic of conversation instead of being like, hey, how was your day? Fine. What'd you do? Nothing. It made it so that the student and their parent could have a deep and meaningful conversation about something that they were both brand new learners at. And that is why I started the podcast. So, like, if you go back to the first like 20 or so episodes, most of those people appeared in my classroom. So, for example, your former colleague, Dr. David Ampanza, was one of my earliest guests, and he would always come to the class and talk to my students about African indigenous traditions. And it was amazing because he was at Mizzou down the street, and he would come out and take time out of his day, come appear in the class and talk to students about his work, his knowledge. And it was just absolutely wonderful. So that's how it started. It started as a class project. And then somebody from a publisher found the podcast and was like, sent me an email and said, hey, do you want to have our author on your podcast? And I was like, wait, what? And then after like 25 or so episodes, it kind of turned into a book podcast for a long time. And that's how I got into interviewing a lot of professors.
That's amazing. I mean, that's an inspired idea to have dinner table conversations. I love that so much.
It was so fun, so fun. And the students and their parents got to bond over something challenging that they probably wouldn't have otherwise talked about. I mean, why would they talk about, like, if you're in Missouri, how would it ever come up that African indigenous religions could be a topic of conversation at the dinner table? Like, that's pretty unlikely. And I feel pretty proud of the fact that those conversations got to be facilitated because of a guest speaker in my classroom and a podcast interview recording.
Well, it does amazing work to bring the conversation to a broader audience. You know, it's one thing to teach kids in the high school, but having an opportunity to access their parents, you know, as well. I mean, that's amazing. So what are some of your favorite classical ideas, interviewees or interviews that you felt like you learned the most from or that were the most impactful to you?
So I have several. I see the podcast sort of as like a series of turning points almost. And it was a delight talking to you for episode 59, by the way, which people can find. Me and Dr. Carrie Duncan having a conversation, and us in the reverse roles as well. And so my all-time most downloaded episode is episode number 32 with Joan Watts, who is the eldest daughter of Alan Watts, which is a name that many people will recognize from his writings on Buddhism. And so hearing about the life of Alan Watts from his daughter, who compiled his collected letters and published it in 2017 and 2018, co-authored with her sister, Ann Watts, Alan Watts' second daughter, who was also on the podcast in the very next episode, in episode number 33. Those were sort of a major turning point for me. And those episodes have been extremely popular. And I started getting emails from historians saying things like, it is so amazing that you have this conversation about the history of Alan Watts recorded. This is something that will be cited in future biographies of Alan Watts' life. And that was really kind of amazing to me. So that was a big one. Another major one for me was episode 29, which is with a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist named Ian Johnson. That was an amazing interview for me. We talked about his book, The Souls of China. And having a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist on my show who writes about the rise of Christianity and Islam within China was a really powerful experience because I researched so long to make sure that I was informed and prepared for that episode. And that really kind of helped me raise my game, knowing that I was going to be talking to somebody who had won a Pulitzer Prize in journalism and that I was going to be interviewing them. So it really helped me realize how much work I can put into this. Another very interesting one for me was episode 112 with a celebrity chef named Eric Repair, who has a Netflix series called Avec Eric. And he was also a featured guest on several episodes of Parts Unknown with Anthony Bourdain. And I interviewed Chef Repair about his Buddhist practice while running a Michelin-starred restaurant in New York City. And that was absolutely amazing as well. Another major episode for me was talking about Muslim women's fashion with Dr. Elizabeth Bucar, who has become a friend and supporter of the podcast in many ways, and has like sort of helped me realize the importance of the podcast as far as like public scholarship goes, and how the conversations that I'm having with professors on such a wide range of topics can be of service to an academic field in which I don't have a terminal degree. And so that was another major one for me as well, is Dr. Bucar.
So speaking of public scholarship, you and the Classical Ideas podcast have become involved with the Sacred Rights Project, a project hosted by Northeastern University and funded by the Henry Luce Foundation, which has as its mission to support public scholarship by scholars of religion. Something that I think that scholars of religion have not historically been so great at doing.
Yeah.
How did you become involved in Sacred Rights? And what commonalities do you see between their goals, their mission, and your own with Classical Ideas?
Well, the accidental segue here is actually really hilarious because the primary investigator of Sacred Rights is Dr. Elizabeth Bucar. So meeting her and Dr. Megan Goodwin and Dr. Kelly Baker and Dr. Judith Weisenfeld, all of whom are either the primary investigator or program directors or on like the editorial board for Sacred Rights. I was meeting these fantastic scholars along the way who then all were kind of like, whoa, this is an interesting project. And they liked the podcast enough to invite me to collaborate with them. So Dr. Bucar invited me so generously to collaborate on a series of episodes where I would interview every one of the Sacred Rights cohort members from 2019, 2020, and 2021. And I'm currently in the midst of recording and interviewing all of the 2021 Sacred Rights cohort. And I'm about 14 episodes into that series, which has been so amazing. And that's how I got involved, was just getting to know Doctors Bucar, Goodwin, Weisenfeld, and Baker, who then were just like, do you want to collaborate with us and make these series of episodes with our featured scholars? And it's been so wonderful. And you mentioned earlier about how the field of religion hasn't really been very good at getting a public facing aspect of it. And that has been my mission the entire time, because I am a person who has taught everything from, sixth grade history to college level teacher education courses. So I have this desire to reach and speak to a wide variety of people, which means that, and I'm not an expert in the field. So what I do is I talk about a huge variety of topics, and I try to tease out of scholars and experts what their field of research does for everybody else in society. So I ask them very pointed questions about why their work should matter to the person who is like sitting in traffic on the way to their job at a bank. Why does this matter? And that is something that I love about what I do, because I don't get bogged down in like lots and lots of terminology or overly academic minutia, because I just simply won't understand what those things mean. So when professors appear on my show, I'm asking them to contribute to the understanding of people who know nothing about that area of interest or expertise. And that is exactly what I think Sacred Writes is doing as well, by encouraging their scholars to appear on a wide variety of podcasts, to publish in a wide variety of publication outlets, to make educational YouTube channels. So I think that my mission of having people in the world understand why these topics are important is completely in line with what Sacred Writes is doing. And I'm just grateful that I get to be a part of it.
That is a very exciting relationship.
Yeah.
So you are currently a lead teacher with Mizzou Academy, which is the University of Missouri's online high school. Well, it's an online K through 12 school.
Yeah.
Where you design and deliver classes on speech, debate, and most recently, religion.
Yes.
You have also presented at the American Academy of Religion annual conferences as a panelist in a section called Religion in Public Schools, International Perspectives. I would like to hear about presenting at the AAR conference and what you want academics in religion and the broader audience to know about the teaching of religious studies at the secondary education level.
So what's really interesting about my appearances at a couple of different conferences over the last couple of years, mostly this year, 2021, is the fact that I actually haven't written a proposal to appear at a conference before. In a religion conference, I tend to just get invited to talk about these things and be on these panels, which is so flattering and so confusing to me. And I accept every invitation because I'm just so grateful that people care about what I do. And the reason why I was invited to talk at AAR about religion in public schools, talking about international perspectives, is that I have a variety of experiences. I taught it in an in-person brick and mortar school in Missouri for 5 years. So I have that experience. I wrote and implemented and have been teaching a fully virtual asynchronous religious studies course for Mizzou Academy, which has enrolled students from all over the world. So that brings in the international perspective as well. And so at the conference, I basically talked about some of my big takeaways from the in-person class, discussed what it was like to write the curriculum based on my in-person experiences for an online audience, and talk about what was challenging and interesting about that process, and then what it's been like to transition from being fully in-person to fully virtual, and what that process was like. So I basically got to do what I think I do okay, which is tell a story about how I transitioned from being an in-person to a fully virtual religious studies teacher. And that's what I was asked to talk about at American Academy of Religion. And it was such a delightful experience to be thought of in that way.
Is definitely the better route to go, to be invited to speak rather than to go through the laborious process of writing an application.
I know. And and whenever I get those types of invitations, I always reply and say, are you sure there isn't somebody who would be more professionally benefited from having this slot? Because I know that in the world of higher education, those types of appearances at conferences are very sought after and essential for the professional advancement of many people in the field. And I'm sort of outside of that realm. And so I would be totally fine with sacrificing my place at a conference so that somebody else who could get more professional exposure to do that instead. But it's been amazing being thought of and invited a couple of times now, because I'm doing it again this month as well.
Nice. And clearly you have a lot to offer that someone within the academy would not. The strictures being what they are.
I mean, I suppose so. And it's just flattering, really. And I don't really know what to say beyond that, because I just get like really nervous and flattered whenever people invite me to do special things like that, because I struggle with self-esteem issues sometimes. So like whenever people are like, oh, Greg, you should come and tell the story, I get really nervous because I'm just worried about not succeeding and having people walk away and be like, why was that guy there? But that's one of the things that that's my own little internal self monologue that tries to get me to, talk myself out of feeling proud of myself, which I've been working on.
Well, good, because I'm glad that you came here to do this special thing.
Oh, you're so welcome. It has been just wonderful to reflect and think about, the show, the podcast, and some of my really amazing memories that I have of my years of teaching religious studies with high school students. It's just been such a thrill to have this kind of job, and thinking back on it just has made my day.
You can find the Classical Ideas podcast and all of those more than 200 scholars of religion that Greg has interviewed wherever you get your podcasts, including where you get this one. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.